All right, now we're going to begin a major change in direction in this course. Namely, we're going to transition to our discussion of humans and religion. And as a prelude to that discussion, we're going to take up the subject of evolution of mankind, and in this presentation with specific reference to the brain size of humans and also the phenomenon of bipedalism. Now, as we get into this, I would like to remind you that it's important for you to read the book. We're going to cover a lot of detail in the book that I will not have time to go over in the tapes. So please do read the book and be aware of that information for upcoming quizzes. So with that, let's get started on this really fascinating subject. It's one that you won't find laid out for you neatly in other places. It's a synthesis that I have put together from available resources and covers quite a bit of information. So I think you'll find it interesting. It's not technically difficult, but it is detailed and fairly lengthy. So in this particular module, we'll first of all make some general remarks about the evolution of mankind, particularly as relevant to hunter-gatherers. We'll go on to a discussion of bipedalism, one of the main aspects of the human body that was changed in the course of evolution. We will then talk about the evolution of the human brain, and lastly, summarize in a very cursory way the relationship of these events to both hope and religion. So with that, let's get started. So you've probably heard that humans evolved, and of course this runs afoul into, shall we say, fundamentalist religious beliefs. And if you are in the latter camp, that is of course you're right, and I would not dream of interfering with that. But my job here is to teach you what we know about the evolution of mankind as a scientific matter. And that is will be my focus for this presentation. You may have seen representations of human evolution, such as the one you see below, although presumably you saw it in a slightly different representation in the scientific summary of this. And I will point out a couple of things in this picture. Whoops, go back. Because there are some errors that we want to take note of. So you see that this sequence begins with a chimpanzee and later becomes sort of a hairy-looking humanoid. And the reason I bring this up is the diagram sort of gives the notion that chimpanzees evolved into ancient humans. And from there on, we got technology, we got language, we got other stuff. So that finally we end up here with Computer Man in a swivel chair as a result. And although humans did undergo a significant evolutionary trajectory, it is not an online linear sequence from chimps to modern man, as we will soon discover. So if we were to focus simply on human evolution, we would have a diagram much more like this. And here you see many ancient hominids, things that look basically human-ish, but are not yet humans in the sense of Homo sapiens, the species to which we belong. So millions of years ago, there were upright beings walking around in sort of a slightly different fashion than our ambulation is today, but you would see names like Australopithecus or the meaning Australopithecus africanus. These are ancient hominids that are not yet human, but in the human lineage. And then finally, when we get to more recent times, we get to the genus Homo, which is the genus to which our species belongs, but you'll note that there are a whole bunch of different ancient humans, all belonging to the genus Homo, but with different specific names. So we have Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, Homo neanderthalis, Homo heidelbergensis, and then finally we get to Homo sapiens, which is us. And just for the record, the name Homo sapiens means literally wise guy. Homo means man, or guy in this case. Sapiens means wise. So we are the wise guy. But the point I want to make is Homo sapiens is the culmination of a long line of experiments with the hominid form, of which there were many fairly recent hominids that looked quite a bit like us and had many of the same features that we have. There are more ancient forms that look less like us and show evidence of the kinds of changes I'm going to be discussing in this presentation. But I do want to dispel the misconception that I began with. We didn't literally descend from the apes. We shared a common ancestor with the apes. Now, for those of you who believe that evolution is a lie straight from the pits of hell, and here I quote Representative Brown from the state of Georgia, who made that statement, this will not be comforting, I realize that. But it is a technical distinction I would like to make. We didn't come directly from the apes. We shared a common ancestor with the apes. And let's take up this question of the relationship of humans to the other primates, which we call the great apes, of which there are 4 different groups. We have the orangutans among the great apes, or Pongo is their correct genus name. We have Pan, which is the chimpanzees and the bonobos. And as you can see, they did not give rise directly to mankind. Homo, we're down here. And what we can discern from this graphic, which is a branching tree describing the evolution of the great apes, including humans, is that way back in the day, we shared a common ancestor that led, on the one hand, to chimpanzees, and on the other hand, through a series of branches, to Homo sapiens. So there's the evidence supporting the notion that we did not descend directly from the chimpanzees, as is so often represented in popular places. Rather, we shared this common ancestor. Okay, but continuing on, in the great apes, we have the genus Homo, which contains 1 extant species, that would be us. Everything else is extinct. And then lastly, we have the gorillas. Those are the 4 groups of great apes of relevance to our discussion. But let's also look at that question that I alluded to earlier, namely, there are many other species belonging to the genus to which we now belong, namely Homo. And that begets the question, well, were these groups all separate in time, or did they at some point coexist? And the reality is, it looks like there was at least some overlap between certain groups of Homo. For instance, Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis probably did coexist and probably did live in the same vicinity. However, they didn't continue to coexist. Homo made it through, and Homo sapiens made it through, but the other groups of Homo died out. So all of the other species belonging to the genus Homo are extinct, except for us. Now, we know that they overlapped because using carbon dating and other methods, we can determine that Homo neanderthalis lived at a time when Homo sapiens was present on Earth. And that is also the case for Homo floresiensis, which was only recently discovered back in 2003, and they are an interesting species of Homo because they were dwarf in size, as were a number of other mammals on the island, Indonesian island, where they found Homo floresiensis. They had tiny, tiny elephants, tiny deer, and tiny humans, all of which date back to about 12,000 years ago, which is, again, consistent with the time of Homo sapiens here on Earth. So it is likely that these groups did overlap. They were contemporaneous, at least at one point. So that then brings up another question, namely, how and why did these other species of Homo die out? And there seem to be a couple of competing arguments. The kinder one is that they were simply out-competed by Homo sapiens, which, as you probably know, has a really big brain and competence with tools and so forth. And probably Homo sapiens just had an edge in securing resources that the other forms of Homo did not. But it's also possible that Homo sapiens actually killed the other forms of Homo, got rid of them, and simply decided, you know what, these other people, I guess we could call them people, are taking our resources. We need to get rid of them so that we can have all those resources. And because Homo sapiens was pretty well fitted out with weapons and so forth, we may have actively exterminated the other species of hominids that were present during the same time that Homo sapiens was present. But we also have a newer piece of information about this interaction. Namely, once we got DNA sequencing and the ability to rapidly screen the DNA of individuals, we discovered that the average contemporary human genome has somewhere between 2 and 3% of Neanderthal genes within the modern genome. So this suggests that, yes, we may have been killing other forms of humans off, but we were also breeding with them, and that evidence is still in our genes. Well, now we're going to look at some of the changes that took place in the hominid line that led to Homo sapiens, us, in other words. And as we do this, there are a whole bunch of different traits that we could consider that changed over time and for which we have good physical records of that change. So one of the first questions we need to ask is, what were the driving forces in our evolution? What were the selective pressures that led to the changes that we want to discuss? And we could choose from a number of different traits to make this case, but certainly one that is demonstrably important and has evidence that it is one of these driving forces is the evolution of bipedalism among hominids. In other words, the ability to walk upright on two legs. We know that bipedalism was found in the earliest hominins, and this would include not only the genus Homo, but the other forms of early humans, as well as the other great apes. As you probably are aware, things like orangutans and gorillas and chimps can ambulate on two legs if they want to. It requires some effort, and they often brace their bodies with their front legs, but they can walk upright if they want to. But we know that between 3 and 4 million years ago, the hominins, which include all of these groups, walked with extended limb ambulation. And this is the primitive ape form of bipedalism that features a bent knee and a bent hip, or BKBH. Sounds like the initials of a serial killer, but no, it's not. It's an early form of bipedal ambulation, which, as I just mentioned, might include using your knuckles to balance the body on the ground if things got tough. So that's how it started, but then it spread and went much further in the human line, particularly in Homo. But we should acknowledge that there are other traits that were important in making mankind what it is, and in therefore defining what it means to be human. And these traits include things like using the hands to make tools, an excessively large brain, which we'll cover in more detail in a bit, the presence of language, spoken language, symbolic language. These are things that are uniquely human. So we could certainly consider these as driving evolutionary forces, but the fact is that bipedalism precedes all of these other things, no matter how meritorious or how influential they turned out to be. And so bipedalism, which took root somewhere between 3 and 4 million years ago, is the earliest such trait on that list. The other traits evolved within the last 100,000 years, and because of its foundational appearance in our lineage, it makes sense to start with bipedalism in this discussion. And it's also the case that you can make the argument that bipedalism, at least to some extent, made the other, and we could possibly call them more advanced traits, possible. So for these reasons, bipedalism is a really good starting point for this discussion. And it's also interesting to note that true bipedalism, particularly as modern humans present it, true bipedalism without the bent knee, bent hip modality is very rare among living things, especially mammals. And one reason for this is that using 4 legs to get around is simply more stable. You're less likely to be knocked over. And also, it's possible to cover more ground at a faster pace. And if you were trying to evade a predator of some sort, it's good to move faster than the predator. So this is one reason why we see quadrupedalism, or the use of 4 legs to get around, as the choice of animals for eons. And early primates, as we've just noted, use a modified version of both quadrupedalism and bipedalism, which includes the knuckle walking gait to get around, because they hadn't yet evolved to the state that modern humans use bipedalism. So it makes sense to focus on bipedalism because it was something that evolved in successive stages over time, and as those stages took place, other changes occurred which augmented the changes occurring with bipedalism. So one of the interesting things about evolution is that a novel trait may secure a foothold on a situation in which the environment is changing that the standard trait will not. And that seems to be the case for bipedalism. At some point, primates who were still living in the trees discovered they could stand up and they could move around on 2 legs rather than 4. And of course, the apes, great apes, were largely living in trees. They had to walk around on branches and limbs. Sometimes they used their arms to swing or brachiate from branches and limbs. And to the extent that an environmental change occurred, there might be a reason to augment the bi-limb mode of locomotion in favor of bipedalism. So was there such an event? Was there a trait that was favored by natural selection because it provided an edge in survival? And the answer is yes. Among the hominids that were sort of, in a sense, pre-adapted for upright walking, in the sense that in the trees, the apes were already standing up on branches with their feet that were adapted to hold on to things, with their big toe being fairly flexible and able to grasp onto things. They already were experiencing upright posture augmented by their arms holding branches and brachiating. So in essence, they sort of started walking in trees, using their arms and hands as a way to steady themselves in this, uneven terrain. But that phenomenon, that capacity to stand up and move using the legs as the primary mode of ambulation, but with hands and arms, bracing the animals in unstable environments, that was a kind of walking that could then be transferred to walking on the ground. So in that sense, apes in the trees, or arboreal primates, were primed for walking upright later on the ground. Now, we will talk about the environmental reasons why bipedalism would have been favored in a later lecture. But let us now acknowledge that once bipedalism took root in humans, the rest of the human body began to change as a result of the bipedal bearing. So one of the things that happened was that the hip bone broadened to increase points of muscle attachment and help balance the human body in this upright position. Here you see a lateral way of doing things in a horse. And you see that the hips are fairly insignificant in comparison to this very wide, impressive blade in the hip that the human being has. And you can also see that there's going to be an interesting series of problems relating to the fact that here is the spine of the horse going in a lateral direction. Here is the spine of the human going in an upright direction. And so we're going to have some gravity problems in the human presentation because that's not the way it was back in the day before modern humans were developed. So we've had some very significant changes to the way the neck and the spine are attached to the rest of the body. One of these is the fact that there is a pronounced S-curve in the lower human spine that you don't see in other animals that are quadrupedal. And this has significance because if you are an engineer or a builder or somebody who messes around with mechanical things, you would know that no sane person would put an S-shaped curve in a load-bearing wall. Well, that's exactly what we have in modern humans, in our spines. And this is the source of endless problems to the human condition. Almost all humans suffer lower back pain to some extent at some point in their life. And it's just due to this crazy arrangement we have here, this S-curve that doesn't adequately support our upright posture in the way that we'd like. Also, women have some interesting issues when they come to bearing children for the same reason. This S-shaped curve is now trying to support, let's say, 50 pounds of extra flesh out here, and that just causes nasty problems with the lower back that cause pain and can sometimes get worse as you get older. So it's just a crazy way to design a being if you're designing something, and it is nonetheless what evolution has given to us, bequeathed to us, as a way to support upright walking, even though our spine is really not, in some respects, up to the task. We also have this interesting situation in which horses, for instance, here you see their head, you see how their spine kind of arches over and supports the head here, but we also have a whole bunch of muscle attachments that are going from the head and the spine to these vertebrae in the back. And these attachments hold the head up in its lateral view here very nicely. In the human, on the other hand, we have basically what I would describe as an apple, in this case the head, situated on a toothpick. In other words, the spine. And we don't have these robust muscle attachments in the same way that quadrupeds do from the head to the vertebrae that quadrupedal animals do. So as a result, we have a real vulnerability in our head. It doesn't withstand blunt force trauma very well, and that's one reason why things like football and getting back-ended in your car and experiencing whiplash can be really devastating for us, because our head is precariously situated on top of this one little tiny tip right here. And as our heads grew bigger, this problem became more intense. So this is just another way of envisioning what I just said with horses. You can see it again with cows. We have this lovely, come on, where's my little pointer? Here we go. We have this lovely upper spine with lovely muscle attachments to the vertebrae that are lower down, and up here we've got a lonely little single articulation holding up this whole massive structure. So it's just an inherently unstable arrangement that we've done well with, at least intellectually, but in terms of sustaining injuries, it's always a source of problems. Some additional changes that took place over evolutionary time as mankind was evolving is that the human teeth became smaller, as did the human jaw. If you look at this is a cattle skull, you can see how big the cattle skull is. Now recognize that the brain is contained here in this little vault, and you can see that the skull is quite large compared to this little place where the brain goes. In humans, we have a whole bunch of teeth, although they became successively smaller. And I mentioned also that the jaw became smaller, but the jaw became smaller at a faster rate than the teeth did. So we have this chronic mismatch between the size of our teeth and the size of our jaws, which in many cases in modern humans means we're going to have a bunch of teeth pulled because there simply aren't enough room for all of them. And everybody, well, not everybody, but many people elect to have their so-called wisdom teeth removed because they are superfluous. They don't come in until you're over 18, and you can get along without them, and they crowd everything else that's already erupted, and so it's a real inconvenience. But one of the reasons why we could get by with smaller teeth, in contrast to the cow that you see here, is two things. One, our brain was becoming larger, and one of the reasons it was becoming larger, it was achieving a larger size as we developed, is that we were able to switch food sources. We were able to go to at least a partial meat-eating diet, and that was facilitated when we became proficient at generating fire. We could cook. The cooking of the meat softened it, broke it down, made it less necessary to have the kind of teeth that are big and with flat surfaces. As we switched to carnivory, we didn't need these huge molars to grind plant materials. The outside layer of plants are extremely difficult to break down. So animals that eat things like grass, such as a cow, have to spend a lot of time macerating the plant material that they're eating, so that when they send it to their digestive system, the digestive tract can extract nutrients from it. So we do have some molars in the back of our mouth, which we still use for that purpose, but unlike the cows and the horses and the other dedicated herbivores, we have fewer of them now than we used to have. We also saw some significant changes in the shoulder of humans relative to the other primates. You recognize that things like apes and chimps and so forth were busy brachiating in trees, and so they had shoulders that were useful for swinging and for climbing. The angle of the shoulder in humans shifted, so that now our arms could hang free. And our hands and arms are carried, for the most part, in front of us. And this allows us to do things like use our hands to do stuff in front of us and also to carry things efficiently. And lastly, the foot in humans changed relative to the other great apes. The foot changed from a grasping structure. Remember, the great apes were up in the trees, and one of the things they would do is use their big toe here, which was quite long and could grasp onto a branch and stabilize an upright gait. So that changed from a grasping structure. Our big toe is much reduced in comparison, and our foot basically is a flat platform that facilitates walking upright. So here you see another comparison of the ape foot with this long toe for grasping branches versus the human big toe, which is unable to depart in this 45-degree angle like the ape toe is, and prefers to stay nestled close to the other toes in our very flat foot. Now, what were the advantages of bipedalism to evolving mankind? Well, we recognize that if you're standing upright and walking upright, the head will be raised, and that allows you to scan the horizon. It increases your field of vision. If you need to be made aware of danger at a distance or the presence of resources you might exploit at a distance, walking with your head in a raised fashion will facilitate this. I've already mentioned that the arms and the hands, which are now not being used for ambulation, for getting around, are free to be used for other things like manipulation of materials, like making tools, transporting those tools and other materials are all now possible because we don't have to use our arms to walk, to get around. And it may be the case that having an upright posture and having a life now not in the trees but on the grounds would give rise to new food resources, such as the literal low-hanging fruits that if you were living in the tree, you might not want to go down and raid these because they would be fairly near the ground and you might be vulnerable to predators. But now if you're on the ground, you could just reach up and grab those low-hanging apples. So it might have led to some new food sources. Oops, wrong way. Another advantage of bipedalism is that over long distances, it tends to be a more efficient gait compared to quadrupedalism. So the cost of being bipedal in energetic terms is lower than it is for quadrupedalism. And this is examined in this paper, the full citation for which is given to you here. And what we learn, if we look at body mass on the x-axis, body mass is increasing in that direction, versus the cost of transportation as measured by oxygen consumption, what we see when we look at three different species, humans, bipedal chimpanzees, and quadrupedal chimpanzees, so chimps walking on 2 legs versus chimps on 4 legs, and it's color-coded, so the yellow dots are the humans walking upright, the red are the bipedal chimps, and the blue are the quadrupedal chimps. And they also measured the difference between running and walking. But what we're going to focus on here are the chimps as a whole. There's a lot of noise in those data for the chimps if you look both at quadrupedal and bipedal chimps, and I suspect that if the data had been properly analyzed statistically, there would be no difference in the quadrupedal versus bipedal chimp movement. However, there's a clear difference between the chimp expenditures of energy and the human expenditures of energy. So, it turns out that bipedalism is energetically less costly. And this has an important implication for the ability of humans, for instance, to hunt. If you are a human and you see a gazelle off in the distance and you decide you want to eat that gazelle for dinner and you start running after it, the gazelle will see you coming and it will take off at a very good clip, and it will easily outrun the human in the short term. However, because the human can hit a gait that is efficient, it will allow the human to run for a much longer period of time, albeit at a slower pace. But over time, the human will be able to overtake the gazelle, which will eventually become exhausted from its over expenditure of energy, and the human can then get that gazelle for dinner. So the quadrupeds are going to have an advantage over short distances and short periods of time, but the humans will have advantages over longer distance and longer periods of time. All right, let's turn to the second factor, namely the evolution of a really big brain among humans. It's pretty easy to demonstrate that increase in brain size, as we have obtained a fair number of intact skulls, particularly from the members of the genus Homo. And we also know that as brain size increased, the bearers of those increased big brains would have increasing ability to do things like alter the environment instead of simply suffering whatever environment was presented. It was possible for human beings to actively change the environment through tool use and the ability to create fire, have better food, and that in turn fueled additional expanses in brain size. So with all those new traits at the behest of Homo sapiens particularly, it fueled an expansion of territory, initially within the continent of Africa, which is where Homo sapiens arose, but eventually around the entire globe and over a very short period of time. And you have to recognize that as people moved, not only within Africa, but out of Africa into Europe, into Asia, even into places like Australia and New Zealand. As that migration took place, the kinds of environments they would have to deal with likewise changed. They would have to figure out what to use, what materials to use to make a boat, how to secure food that wouldn't kill them because it had poisons but was good to eat and nutritious. How to cook those new foods. All of this would have to be negotiated as humans were migrating around the globe. And it turns out that one of the reasons why humans left Africa was because there was a prolonged drought millions of years ago, which probably meant that the arboreal existence that the other primates were using became less favored. The fruits in the trees were drying up. And so that forced organisms that wanted to make a living to the ground. And the movement to the ground probably ushered in bipedalism. Now, here we see the cranial capacity for members of the primates. The orangs and the chimps are about the same, even though the body size of the orangutans tends to be bigger. Gorillas have a bigger average and a bigger range. But humans, whoa, look at that. Huge, huge change between the other primates and humans. And here humans means Homo sapiens. We do see among the Neanderthals, which recall, are also members of the genus Homo, we do see a range that very much overlaps with the human range, and on the upper end appears to be somewhat larger. But you have to recall also that the number of skulls we have to work with the Neanderthals is minuscule in comparison to Homo sapiens. And so I don't have a lot of confidence in that range. My assumption is that if you were to take an average of the existing Neanderthal skulls and the Homo sapiens skulls, that we would discover that the average Homo sapiens skull is larger than that of the average Neanderthal. So why was this increase in brain size so important? As I mentioned, humans were driven out of the trees through an extended drought. They began not only to look for food on the ground, but to leave the immediate area and start to look for additional resources in other locations. There was a fair amount of unpredictability for those resources, and this, of course, led to the expansion of humans, the movement out of the cradle of creation of humans to other places because they needed food. And as they migrated into these new sites, there would be huge unpredictability in the resource base, the climatary base, the kinds of perils they might face. And in order to negotiate all of these difficulties, they had to have much better cognitive skills to evaluate everything, the needs that they would face, the dangers that they would face, and also the possibilities that they might encounter as they moved around the globe. So the expansion of mankind around the globe depended upon being able to eke a living out in very diverse environments, which had been previously unknown. We had no collective history in these places. All of this stuff was new and had to be negotiated, in essence, on the fly. So that was a driving force in having a progressively larger and larger brain in emerging humans. But there was an expense that came with having those big brains. As our brains get bigger, the cost of maintaining that big brain is high. It means that we have to have protein-rich food. And if we don't have it, our brain will not function at its maximum capacity. So this is another reason why humans left the African homeland in search of abundant resources elsewhere. It appears that the development of the prefrontal cortex, the neocortex if you prefer, was essential in providing our brains with the cognitive capacity to deal with these numerous challenges. And there would have been intense natural selection for big brains as well as for the executive functions that are concentrated in the neocortex under your forehead. But having this increasingly large brain had complications. All benefits seem to have complications. And one of the immediate complications was realized in the form of childbearing. We've talked about this before. But as human heads increased their size, and refer back to the graph or the table with the different primates laid out, as well as their average brain size, and you can see that the human brain increased at a massive rate. And so this meant that in order simply to give birth to a child with that size head, we couldn't do it in the way other animals do it. In other words, most mammals are born with most of their adult capacities, if not present at birth, present soon after birth. But that is not the case with humans. We have an extended period lasting years in which humans are very immature. They're completely dependent on caring adults to shepherd them through this lengthy period of absolute dependence. And in order to make that happen, to have the necessary personnel in residence for that length of time during which the child is highly dependent, it was advantageous to have a family structure in which both the mother and the father were united in a long-term pair bond underwritten by neurobiochemical algorithms that facilitated the evolution and the sustaining of that pair bond for long periods of time. In other words, the only way that humankind could make it on a global scale was to develop not only the body structure and the attendant changes that we've already discussed, but a societal structure, the one that we currently have. We're going to talk about the changes in human society that were relevant to the success of mankind as hunter-gatherers in a later lecture. It's that important that we're simply going to take much of a presentation and look at that specifically. But the other thing I want to bring up and to get you thinking about as we move on to that discussion is how all of this relates both to hope and religion, the two major topics of this course. Well, it should be clear to you now that hope exists in humans, and it is likely that within a population of diverse humans, that the production of hope, to the extent that it is genetic in nature, would be variable in nature. So when a population is under stress, and let's face it, when humans were migrating from their African homeland across the globe, they would be under constant stress. It could be war, it could be lack of food, it could be uncertainty about how to secure resources down the line, it could be the inability to find shelter. There was stress on a massive scale, pretty much on a continuing basis. Under such circumstances, it seems logical to argue that those populations, those human enclaves that had a greater degree of hope, were more likely to survive and reproduce under these fairly dire, highly stressful situations. As a result, there would be selective pressure in favor of hope, leading to increases in genes for the production of hope within a population under these circumstances. Let's revisit that which we've been talking about in this lecture, namely, we humans got where we are today because we had those really big brains that had all these capacities like tool making and language and just the ability to think and reason and adjust to changes occurring in the environment on the fly. This gave us tremendous advantages over other species, including other hominid forms. But because of our really big head, which cannot be formed fully at birth, and the fact that the human head continues to grow and develop throughout our first 18 years of life. I mean, we are unfinished business until the age of 18. So while we become more functional as time wears on, we're not completely dependent when we're 12 or 14 or even 18. We still have aspects of immaturity that make it unwise to put us out there on our own until we get to roughly the age of majority, when society defines that you're independent at that point. But it can vary from somewhere between, let's say 13 and 18, depending on the period of time we're talking about and the society that we're looking at. Prior to that time, prior to the fledging of the young person, we need parents or parental figures to protect and to teach. And for that reason, hope is critical to keeping that family unit intact so that they can do the job of getting those highly dependent children to the point of maturity and independence. So Lionel Tiger put it this way, quote, "Children require a long period of close emotional relationship with protective adult figures in order to function effectively as adults themselves. If they do not have such relationships, whatever technical skills they may acquire, their performance in life will be inhibited or distorted by basic social incompetence." So it's not merely a matter of keeping the kid from falling in the river or from being eaten by a tiger. It's also a matter of inculcating those cultural values and norms that will make the child a functioning member of society when he grows up. If he hasn't learned those elements, if he has no idea what correct behavior is, or what the group thinking on God is, he will not have the social competence that he requires to get on in life. Tiger also had this to say, quote, "Humans have a wired-in propensity to learn rapidly and massively in the early part of the life cycle. There is a corresponding readiness in the adult to teach, as well as a concern with meaning and moral implication of what is taught. There is a biology for both learning and teaching," unquote. So this too is an important point. Our human evolution has prepared human society to have the necessary skills built into these social arrangements. Young children have, as a part of their genetic heritage, this hardwired desire and ability to learn things at a massive rate in the early part of their life. In the first couple of years of life, the rate of learning is intense, but we're built for it. We can do it. And similarly, the adults who need to be doing all of this teaching likewise have a genetic heritage that drives them to undertake this teaching. We do this willingly. We do it as a part of what we understand it means to be human. Finally, the last quote from Tiger I will inflict on you today, quote, "Protection is essential to a child's development. It may also be essential to producing and maintaining the tone of hopefulness," there's that hope thing again, "about his or her life, which stimulates action and zest invested in the accomplishments of children." So Tiger is arguing that this thing called hope plays a critical function in keeping families together and also in helping them function properly to raise children to independence. And this is another reason why families that are capable of producing healthy, happy reproductive adults will also leave a lot of offspring. And back in the day of evolving humans, when we're migrating around the globe, it was awfully important to be able to leave as many offspring as possible because there were so many hazards and uncertainties likely to claim many of those offspring. As this was playing out, this phenomenon called tribalism developed as the preferred social structure. What this meant was that humans existed preferentially as small bands of related individuals. They flocked together in these small bands. They lived together. They migrated together during the time that we existed as hunter-gatherers. The society that was built from tribalism was egalitarian in nature. There was no preferred individual. There was no tribal leader. The work was shared, and the resources was shared relatively equally. And from this interesting stew of ideas and capacities, a group ethos was formed, a group identity was cemented, and group mores, habits, and moral understandings were forged. This included the evolution of altruism, which we will discover is an anomaly among animals. Also, it cemented our ability to procure enough food to feed those very big brains, to fight off predators and other humans, likewise, to produce a stable society. And what you will notice about this last bullet is that the things that are discussed, the procurement of food and the warding off of predators, including other humans, are two things that require group cooperation, which is another characteristic of hunter-gatherer society and something we'll discuss again later as well. So if we look at the important question in all of this, how do we keep hope, which undergirds many of the really important features that allowed mankind to be successful, how do we keep that going in what is demonstrably an unsympathetic environment or series of environments into which humankind moved without knowing what the environmental dynamics were, what the resource acquisition would be like, or what kind of bad things like predators, including other human forms, might be. We also know that life back then, as now, was a situation in which there will be demonstrable winners and losers. Some people will get eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. Others will have wildebeest for dinner. That's just the nature of things. But we have to ask, during those times of rampant uncertainty, how did we keep society together? The society that was tribalism based was nonetheless potentially fraught with problems. What is the glue that held this interesting collection of people together in such a way that society could be productive and that reproduction of young people would take place? And the answer to that seems to be that in addition to hope, we have religion, which in some respects is simply an outward codification of hope. With religion, we had some interesting things coming into being. Hope could perhaps give us a sense that there would be something beyond the current life. Hope provided a rationale for suffering. But this was also the case for religion, and we can take many religions. I've chosen a selection here from Christianity, which says, I was not born of this world, suggesting there's both another world somewhere else to which we will go, and that if we endure suffering in this world, there will be a better place later on. This is a theme throughout a whole bunch of divine texts. E.O. Wilson, whom you'll meet in detail later on, said in his book Consilience, quote, our conscious minds hunger for a permanent existence. If we cannot have everlasting life of the body, then absorption into some immortal whole will serve. And so that is one of the reasons, according to Wilson, that religion is so important to us. It helps us achieve this sense of this is not all there is, that I will continue to exist even after my mortal body no longer does. So to some extent, the rules of religion reinforce those factors that lead to successful reproduction, particularly the maintenance of the family and tribal structure. So one final quote from Wilson, people need the affirmation, the poetry of affirmation. They crave an authority greater than themselves at rites of passage and other moments of high seriousness. So again, we have this inherent need to have the promise of enduring beyond our current incarnation. And between hope and religion, we can fashion such a cloth. And here is your study guide for the upright ape.